The air at the Miller County Equipment Auction hung thick and heavy, a familiar cocktail of spent diesel, greasy hot dogs, and the damp, metallic smell of rusting iron. It was October of '72, and the harvest moon had given way to a pale, indifferent sun. I stood near the back of the crowd, my hands buried deep in the pockets of my canvas work coat, feeling the worn smoothness of a half-dozen lock washers I'd forgotten to take out. My name is Calvin Miller, and on that day I wasn't looking to buy. I was just looking. Most of the lots were the usual fare: worn-out disc harrows with a few cracked blades, a New Holland haybine that had seen one too many rock-filled fields, and a parade of tired Ford 8N tractors that looked like they'd been pulled from the back of a barn after 30 years of sleep. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Jimmy Ross, could sell a blind man a photograph, and he was working the crowd into a mild frenzy over a John Deere 4020 with 8,000 hours on the clock and a suspicious amount of fresh green paint. Then they dragged it out. It wasn't a tractor, it was a monument to failure. A Steiger Cougar 2, one of the first big, articulated four-wheel drives to show up in our part of Iowa, or what was left of it. The big beast was scorched black from the cab forward, the massive tires were melted into sagging puddles of rubber, the hydraulic lines hung down like burnt spaghetti, and the iconic Steiger green paint was blistered and peeled, revealing angry patches of rust-colored steel. A fire, and a bad one. A wave of murmurs went through the crowd. Men shook their heads. It was a carcass, a 10-ton piece of scrap iron, good for nothing but the cutting torch. "All right, gentlemen, what am I bid for this da project?" Jimmy Ross chirped, trying to put a positive spin on a catastrophe. "The engine's in her, the transmission's in her. Lot of good parts if you've got the time." Silence, nobody wanted to touch it. It was bad luck. Then a familiar booming laugh cut through the quiet. Bob Henderson. He pushed his way to the front, his brand-new seed corn cap perched on his head, a stark white against his sun-reddened neck. Henderson had bought the farm next to mine 5 years back and had immediately put himself in debt up to his eyeballs for the latest and greatest. He'd just taken delivery of a John Deere 4630, complete with an enclosed cab and air conditioning. He'd drive by my place, sitting up in his glass box, and give me a little wave as I wrestled with my old Open Station International 806, eating dust all day. "Well, I'll be," Henderson bellowed, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Looks like someone tried to farm a little too hard." "What happened, Jimmy? Did the bank try to repossess it mid-field?" A few nervous chuckles rippled through the farmers. Most of them were in the same boat as Henderson, borrowing heavy to get bigger. I stayed quiet, my eyes tracing the lines of the burnt machine. I walked closer, ignoring the snickers. I knelt down, the knees of my jeans soaking up the damp, oily ground. I looked past the fire damage. I looked at the frame. The main articulation joint, the heart of the beast, looked solid. The planetary hubs on the axles were massive, built for a war. The transmission casing wasn't cracked. The fire had been hot and fast, mostly electrical and hydraulic fluid. But the bones were good. "What's the matter, Cal?" Henderson's voice was right behind me, dripping with condescension. "Thinking of trading in that old Farmel of yours? This one's only got 2 more wheels than you're used to." I stood up, wiping my greasy hand on my jeans. I looked him square in the eye. "She's got a Cummins in her, Bob." "A fried Cummins," he shot back. "You'd spend more on gaskets and wire than the whole thing's worth." "You ought to come down to the bank, Cal. They're practically giving money away. Get yourself a real tractor, something that starts with a key, not a prayer." My father, who'd carved our farm out of the land with his own 2 hands and a Farmel M he bought with cash in 1948, had one rule: if you can't pay for it with the money in your pocket, you can't afford it. He'd seen the Depression eat his neighbors alive, seen the banks sell off generations of hard work for pennies on the dollar. That lesson was branded on me deeper than any cattle mark. While Henderson and the others were signing loan papers, I was rebuilding carburetor floats and welding cracked manifolds. My farm was small, just a quarter section, but it was mine. Every last fence post. $200 for the scrap, a voice from the crowd finally offered. $200. Jimmy Ross yelped, his rhythm returning. "I've got 200. Who'll give 250? 250. The tires alone are worth that for the rubber." 250. I said, my voice quiet but clear. Henderson turned and stared at me, his jaw slack. The whole crowd seemed to turn. Calvin Miller, the man who patched his own tires and straightened his own plowshares, was bidding on the biggest, most hopeless piece of junk in the county. 300, the first bidder shot back. 350, I said, not taking my eyes off the Steiger. Henderson started laughing again, a real belly laugh this time. You've lost your mind, Miller. What are you going to do with that thing? Use it as a chicken coop? 400, I said. The other bidder dropped out, shaking his head and walking away. $400 going once, Jimmy Ross chanted, his eyes wide. Going twice? Sold. To Calvin Miller for $400. The gavel cracked like a gunshot. A heavy silence fell over the auction. Bob Henderson just stood there, a smirk plastered on his face, shaking his head as if I were the biggest fool God ever created. He thought I'd bought a 10-ton anchor. I knew, deep in my gut, I'd just bought my future. I paid Jimmy Ross the $400 from a roll of cash I kept for emergencies, the paper bills worn soft as cloth. Before we get into the grease and the busted knuckles of this rebuild, I have to ask you all something. Have you ever known a man like my father, or a man like me? The kind who'd rather spend a week grinding valves on an old engine than spend 10 minutes signing a bank loan? The kind of man who believes that the only thing you truly own is the thing you don't owe anyone for? Let me know what you think in the comments below, because I need to know if that kind of thinking still exists in the world. It's important. It's the whole reason this story happened. Getting the Steiger home was the first battle. It was dead weight, all 20,000 pounds of it. I had to call up old man Fitzherbert, who ran the local heavy hauling service. He showed up with his ancient autocar semi and a lowboy trailer that sagged in the middle. Calvin, what in God's name did you do? Fitzherbert grumbled, chewing on an unlit cigar as he looked at the burnt hulk. I got a good deal, Fitz. You got a boat anchor. It'll cost you $100 just to get it to your place. That's a quarter of what you paid for the damn thing. I know, I said. Just get the winch on it. It was a slow, groaning process. The winch cable on the autocar strained, and the big semi's diesel engine belched black smoke as it dragged the dead Steiger up onto the trailer. Henderson had stuck around to watch the show, leaning against the fender of his shiny Ford pickup. As we finally got it loaded, he sauntered over. You'll have that thing sitting in your weeds for the next 20 years, Cal, he said, not unkindly, but with the certainty of a man who knows he's right. It's a shame. You're a good farmer. You just don't think big enough. He drove off then, leaving me with Fitzherbert and my monstrous purchase. We chained it down, and the whole rig groaned its way down the county roads to my place. I had him drop it in the grassy area behind my machine shed, the only place flat enough and big enough to hold it. For weeks it just sat there, an ugly black monument to what everyone in the county was calling Calvin's folly. My wife Sarah was patient, but I could see the worry in her eyes. $400 was a lot of money for us, money that could have gone to a new stove or patching the roof on the porch. What is it, Cal? She asked me one night, looking out the kitchen window at the dark shape silhouetted against the moon. It's a chance, Sarah, I told her, a chance to farm right. To get the crop in when the ground is fit, not when my little tractor can finally get around to it. The winter of '72 came early and hit hard. The ground froze solid by Thanksgiving, and the snows piled up deep. For most farmers, it was a time to rest, to go into town, to plan for next year. For me, it was time to go to work. I dragged a set of heavy-duty floodlights out to the Steiger and ran extension cords from the barn. Every night after the chores were done and our boy David was in bed, I'd pull on my insulated coveralls and head out into the biting cold. The teardown was a brutal, filthy job. Everything was coated in a mixture of soot, melted plastic, and oily grime. I started with the wiring, or what was left of it. It was a hopeless melted spiderweb. I cut it all out, every last strand, knowing I'd have to rewire the entire machine from scratch. The hydraulic lines were next. I used a 3-foot pipe wrench to break the fittings loose, the frozen steel groaning in protest. Each one gushed a foul-smelling, burnt slurry of hydraulic fluid that froze almost as soon as it hit the ground. The cab was a total loss. The seat was a pile of springs and ash. The gauges on the dashboard were melted puddles of glass, and the steering wheel was a bare metal ring. I unbolted the whole structure and, with the help of my engine hoist, lifted the twisted wreck off the frame and dragged it to the scrap pile. Finally, I got to the heart of the matter: the engine. A Cummins NTC 335, a legendary engine, but this one was in a bad way. The fire had cooked everything external. The belts, the hoses, the alternator, all garbage. I pulled the valve covers, and my heart sank a little. The oil inside was thick and black, the consistency of tar. Not a good sign. I spent a week just getting the engine ready to pull. The bolts holding it to the frame were massive, 1.5 inches at least. I had to put a 6-foot cheetah pipe on my biggest breaker bar, my whole body straining against it until the bolt would finally surrender with a deafening crack. I hooked up the engine hoist, the chains stretched taut, and slowly, inch by inch, I lifted the 5,000-pound block of iron out of the chassis. I got it into the shop, which was really just a clean corner of my machine shed with a concrete floor and a potbelly stove for heat. I put the engine on a stand and started the real exploratory surgery. I pulled the head. The pistons were black with carbon, and there was scoring on the cylinder walls. Bad, but maybe salvageable. Then I pulled the oil pan. And there it was. A fist-sized hole blown clean through the side of the engine block. A connecting rod had let go, shattering itself and turning the inside of my engine into a blender full of metal shavings. The engine wasn't just dead, it was butchered. The block, the crank, the rods, all of it was scrap. I sat down on an overturned bucket, the smell of cold iron and burnt oil filling my lungs. I stared at the hole in the side of that Cummins block. Henderson's words echoed in my head. "Fried Cummins, you've lost your mind, Miller." For the first time, I felt a cold knot of doubt tighten in my stomach. Maybe they were all right. Maybe I had just bought the most expensive chicken coop in Miller County. The coffee shop in town was the unofficial headquarters of local opinion. It was a place where you could get a cup of coffee for a dime, a piece of pie for a quarter, and a whole load of unsolicited advice for free. After I'd dragged the Steiger home, I became the main topic of conversation. I'd walk in and the chatter would die down for a second before starting up again in hushed tones. Bob Henderson was usually there, holding court at the big round table in the center. "Saw Calvin out there last night," I heard him say one morning as I slid into a booth in the corner. "Looked like a scene from a Frankenstein movie, sparks flying from a grinder in the middle of a blizzard. He's working on that burnt-up monster. I tell you, the man's got more stubbornness than sense." An older farmer named Gus, who farmed the section north of Henderson, nodded in agreement. "In this day and age, you can't afford the downtime, Bob. You know that. I just signed for a new IH 1066. The payments are steep, but I'll have it paid off in 5 years with the price of corn what it is. You got to spend money to make money." That was the new gospel. The bank was the church, the loan officer was the preacher, and debt was the path to salvation. Land prices were ticking up every month, and the talk from the Department of Agriculture was all about expansion. "Plant fence-row to fence-row," Secretary Earl Butts was telling everyone. The world was hungry, and American farmers were going to feed it. The money was flowing. I just kept my head down, ordered my coffee, and read the classifieds in the back of Successful Farming magazine. I was hunting for an engine. I spent my evenings on the phone, the old black rotary phone in our kitchen, calling salvage yards all over the Midwest. "Got a Cummins NTC 335, I'd ask. "Might have one," the voice on the other end would crackle back. "Out of a Peterbilt that rolled over outside Des Moines, but she ain't cheap." They wanted thousands for a used engine, more than I could possibly afford. My hope began to fade. The Steiger sat behind the shed, a black skeleton half buried in the snow. My International 806, which had been my main tillage tractor, was showing its age. The clutch was slipping, and I knew it was going to be a big job to split the tractor and replace it. A job I'd have to do before spring planting. The pressure was mounting. One night, after a dozen dead-end phone calls, I found a listing in a trucking paper. It wasn't for an engine, it was for a whole truck. A 1968 Kenworth, wrecked. The ad said, "Cab and frame damaged beyond repair, drivetrain intact." The yard was in Kearney, Nebraska, a 5-hour drive away. The ad said it had a Cummins. It didn't say which one. The next morning, I told Sarah I was going for a drive. I took our old Ford F-100 pickup and headed west on the highway. The Nebraskan landscape was flat and windswept, the sky a vast, empty gray. The salvage yard was a sprawling graveyard of twisted metal. The owner was a grizzled man with a face like a road map. "The Kenny? Yeah, she's out back," he grunted, pointing with his thumb. "Took a real hard hit." I found it at the back of the yard. The truck was folded up like an accordion, but when I looked at the engine, my heart started to beat a little faster. It was dirty, but it was all there. I scraped some of the grime off the tag on the block. Cummins NTC 350. It was even better than the original. More horsepower. "What do you want for the engine?" I asked the owner. "Gotta take the whole wreck," he said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "Not worth my time to pull it for you. $1,500 you haul it." $1,500. It was every cent I had saved up. It was my seed money for next spring. It was a gamble that could break me. I thought about my 806 with its slipping clutch. I thought about Bob Henderson in his heated cab. I thought about farming another year with underpowered, worn-out equipment, always one breakdown away from disaster. "I'll take it," I said. I paid the man in cash. He counted it twice. Then came the problem of getting it home. I arranged for Fitzherbert to make the trip out to Nebraska the following week. Another $300 for the hauling. The cost of my folly was growing. When the wrecked Kenworth arrived at my farm, it looked even more hopeless than the Steiger had. My neighbors, what few I had on my gravel road, slowed down to gawk. The news was all over the coffee shop the next day. Not only had Calvin Miller bought a burnt tractor, now he'd bought a smashed-up semi to go with it. The consensus was that I had finally, officially gone crazy. But that winter, working under the harsh glare of my floodlights in the freezing cold, I pulled that big Cummins out of the mangled truck frame. I put it on the engine stand in my shop, and this time, when I pulled the pan, the inside was clean. The crankshaft was smooth. The bearings looked good. It was a healthy engine. It took me the rest of the winter to get it ready. I swapped over the flywheel housing from the old engine to make it fit the Steiger's transmission. I had to fabricate new motor mounts from quarter-inch steel plate, measuring a dozen times before cutting and welding. I bought a new alternator, a new starter, and a new wiring harness for the engine, spending money I barely had. By the time the spring thaw of '73 came, I had the new engine sitting in the Steiger's frame. It wasn't a tractor yet. It had no cab, no hydraulics, no electrical system. It was just a frame, 4 wheels, and a powerful engine. But it was a start. It was the beginning of hope. The mid-1970s were a golden age for farmers who were willing to take a risk. The Soviet grain deal had sent crop prices into the stratosphere. A bushel of corn, which had been worth a little over $1 for most of my life, was suddenly fetching $3 or more. Land that had sold for $500 an acre was suddenly worth $1,500, then $2,000. And the banks were practically begging farmers to borrow money against that inflated value. It was a wild, heady time. Bob Henderson was riding the crest of that wave like a champion. He bought another 240 acres, leveraging his existing land to get the loan. He traded in his 4630 for a brand new John Deere 4840 with power shift transmission and a sound guard cab so quiet you could hear the radio over the engine. He bought a bigger planter, a bigger disc, a bigger combine. His operation was the talk of the county, a modern, efficient, and deeply leveraged empire. He was farming nearly 1,000 acres, while I was still working my 160. He'd see me out in the field on my old 806, which I'd finally found time to split and put a new clutch in, and he'd slow his massive new tractor down, lean out of his air-conditioned cab and yell, "Still playing with those antiques, Cal? You're missing the boat." He wasn't being cruel, not really. He genuinely believed he was helping me, that he was showing me the path to prosperity. In his eyes, I was a failure, a stubborn fool who was letting the opportunity of a lifetime pass him by because of some old-fashioned fear of debt. The rest of the community saw it that way too. I was the cautionary tale, the man who refused to change with the times. Meanwhile, my folly was slowly, painfully coming to life. The work was relentless. After putting in a 12-hour day in the field, I'd spend another 4 or 5 hours working on the Steiger. I ran all new hydraulic lines, hundreds of feet of them, carefully bending and routing them along the frame. I bought used gauges from a truck stop, oil pressure, water temp, a tachometer, and mounted them on a simple steel panel where the dashboard used to be. I bought a single seat from a salvage yard, the kind used in a school bus, and bolted it to the floor. The wiring was the biggest nightmare. I'm a mechanic, not an electrician. I bought spools of colored wire and a book on basic DC circuits. I spent weeks tracing diagrams, running wires for the starter, the alternator, the gauges, the lights. My hands were always cut and scraped, my fingernails permanently black with grease. By the fall of 1975, 2 years after I'd dragged it home, the machine was ready for its first test. It was still ugly. The frame was the original faded Steiger green, the engine was Cummins beige, and the new metal I'd welded on was coated in red primer. It had no cab, no fenders, just a seat, a steering wheel, and the basic controls. It looked like something out of a Mad Max movie. I climbed up onto the seat, my heart pounding in my chest. I'd sunk thousands of dollars and countless hours into this thing. Everything I owned was tied up in my land, and every spare cent and moment was tied up in this pile of iron. I checked the fuel line one last time. I hit the starter button. The big starter motor groaned, turning the massive engine over. 1 revolution, 2. A puff of white smoke came from the exhaust stack. Then, with a deafening roar, the 855 cubic inch Cummins engine exploded to life. It wasn't the smooth rumble of the new John Deere's. It was a deep, guttural, angry thunder that shook the ground. A thick cloud of black smoke billowed from the straight pipe exhaust, blotting out the sun. The whole machine vibrated with raw, untamed power. I let it warm up, my hands trembling slightly as I held the steering wheel. I pushed in the heavy clutch pedal and pulled the transmission into first gear. It lurched forward. I drove it out of the yard and into the harvested cornfield. I opened the throttle, and the response was instantaneous. The tractor surged forward with a force I had never experienced before. This wasn't a tractor, it was a locomotive. It had more power, more raw pulling strength than anything else in the county. Over the next few years, while Henderson and the others were going deeper into debt, I was putting my beast to work. I bought a used 24-foot field cultivator and a 7-bottom plow, implements my old 806 could only dream of pulling. I could do my full tillage in a third of the time it used to take me. I was able to get my crops in faster during the perfect window of weather, which led to better yields. I wasn't making the kind of money Henderson was, but my profits were my own. I was slowly building a war chest, salting away cash from every good harvest. To everyone else, I was still just Crazy Cal with his homemade tractor. Henderson would see me out there in the open, covered in dust, and just shake his head. He was living the high life, taking vacations to Florida in the winter, buying his wife a new car. I was still driving my 10-year-old Ford pickup and patching the barn roof myself. I looked like I was falling further and further behind, but I was listening to the farm report on the radio. I was reading the financial pages, and I was hearing a name I'd never heard before, Paul Volcker. He was the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, and he was talking about a new enemy. Not low crop prices, but something called inflation. He was talking about raising interest rates to combat it. The rates on operating loans crept from 8% to 10%, then to 12%. The music at the party was still loud, but for the first time I could hear a dissonant note. A low rumble of thunder, way off in the distance, from a storm cloud that was promising to carry a whole lot more than just rain. The summer of 1980 was a scorcher. The sky over Iowa turned a hazy, bleached-out blue and stayed that way for weeks. The corn tassels, which should have been plump and yellow with pollen, were turning a brittle, sterile white. The ground cracked open in patterns that looked like broken glass. It was the kind of heat that made the air shimmer over the blacktop roads and drove men to silence. At the coffee shop, the talk wasn't about yields anymore, it was about survival. On top of the drought, President Carter had slammed the door on grain sales to the Soviet Union. The price of corn fell through the floor. The golden goose that had laid $3 a bushel eggs was dead. For men like Bob Henderson, who had borrowed against the promise of high prices, it was like the world had tilted off its axis. I saw the first real crack in his empire one blistering afternoon in July. I was cultivating my soybeans with the old 806, the heat radiating up from the engine block in punishing waves. Up on the road, I saw Henderson's prized John Deere 4840, his symbol of ultimate success, sitting dead still, hooked to a massive 32-foot disc. A green and yellow service truck from the dealership in the county seat was parked beside it. Curiosity got the better of me. At the end of the row, I shut down the International and walked up the ditch to see what was going on. Henderson was standing there, his arms crossed, his face flushed a deep, angry red that had nothing to do with the sun. A young mechanic in a clean uniform was staring at a tangle of wires under the tractor's side panel, a bewildered look on his face. "What's the trouble, Bob?" I asked, keeping my voice even. He barely glanced at me. "Quad range won't shift out of park, things locked up tighter than a drum." He kicked one of the huge rear tires, the rubber too hot to touch. "Damn thing's got more wires in it than a telephone exchange. The kid here's been on the phone with Des Moines for an hour." The mechanic, no older than my son David, looked up. "It's the electronic shift control module, Mr. Henderson. It's fried. We don't have one in stock. Have to order it from the factory in Waterloo." "And how long will that take?" Henderson bit out the words. "Could be a week, maybe 2. They're having some supply issues." "A week?" Henderson's voice cracked. "I've got 600 acres of beans to spray, and this ground needs to be worked before we get another gully washer." "A week?" "And the part, sir," the mechanic said, steeling himself. "With the service call and labor to install it, you're probably looking at around $2,000. Henderson looked like he'd been punched in the gut. $2,000. In 1975, that was a down payment on a new pickup. In 1980, with corn prices collapsing, it was a king's ransom. He turned and saw me standing there, listening. His face hardened. "What are you looking at, Miller?" he snapped. "Haven't you got some old junk to weld back together?" He turned his back on me and stormed off toward his truck, leaving the young mechanic to pack up his tools. I walked back to my 806. I climbed into the seat, pushed in the clutch, and pulled the simple mechanical lever into gear. It clunked into place with a satisfying thud. As I drove away, I looked back at the magnificent, complex, and utterly useless John Deere sitting silent in the field. It was a 200-horsepower paperweight. That winter, the interest rates started their climb. Paul Volcker was waging his war on inflation, and the prime rate, the number that dictated everything, went from 12% to 15%, then to a terrifying 18%. The variable rate loans that farmers had signed so eagerly in the 70s were suddenly ticking time bombs. The letters from the bank started to change their tone. Friendly reminders became firm notices. The word restructuring started appearing in conversations at the co-op. My Steiger, which everyone still called Calvin's Folly, was my shield against it all. I had spent a few $100s the year before building a simple, functional cab for it out of square tubing and sheet metal. I used plexiglass for windows and put in a heater core from a wrecked school bus. It was ugly and loud, but it kept the winter wind off me. I could fix anything on that tractor with a set of wrenches and a welder. The Cummins engine had no electronics, no computers. It ran on diesel fuel and simple physics. When a hydraulic hose burst, I could drive to the auto parts store, buy a new one for $20, and have it fixed in an hour. I was burning my own fuel, turning my own wrenches, and sleeping soundly at night. The crisis hit full force in the spring of '82. It was a silent, creeping plague. Land values, which had been the foundation of the borrowing boom, collapsed by more than half. Farmers who were leveraged 60% against their land were suddenly 120% leveraged. They were bankrupt on paper, and the banks knew it. The auction notices started appearing in the paper like obituaries. First, it was the younger guys, the ones who had jumped in with both feet in the late 70s. Then it started claiming the established farmers, men whose families had worked the same ground for a century. The coffee shop grew quiet and grim. Men who used to brag about their horsepower now stared into their cups. Their faces etched with a fear I recognized from my father's stories of the Depression. Bob Henderson held on longer than most. He was a good farmer, and he fought like a cornered animal. He sold off his new combine. He let go of his hired man. He tried to refinance, but the bank wouldn't even talk to him. His operating loan was at 21% interest. Every bushel of corn he sold cost him more to grow than he got for it. He was drowning. The notice for his auction ran in the paper in October of 1983. It was a full-page ad, a complete liquidation. 1,000 acres of prime Iowa farmland, a full line of late-model John Deere equipment, the house, the barns, everything. The bank was picking the bones clean. The day of the auction was cold and grey, with a raw wind that cut to the bone. The whole county was there, but it didn't feel like an auction. It felt like a funeral. The farmers stood in tight, silent groups, their hats pulled down low. They weren't there to find a bargain. They were there to watch a public execution and wonder who was next. I saw Bob standing by the machine shed, a place where he had once reigned as king. He looked 10 years older. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. His new seed corn cap was gone, replaced by an old stained hat that looked as beaten as he did. He wasn't the proud, booming man I had known. He was a ghost. His wife was beside him, her face a mask of quiet grief. The auctioneer, a man I didn't know from out of town, hired by the bank, started with the small items first. The tools, the welders, the air compressor. They went for pennies on the dollar. No one had any cash. Then came the tractors. His 4840, the one that had broken down that hot summer day, was driven up. It was clean, waxed and polished, but it looked like a show horse being led to the glue factory. "All right, folks, here's the flagship of the fleet," the auctioneer barked, trying to inject some life into the dead crowd. "A John Deere 4840, low hours, ready to work. What am my bid?" Silence. The only sound was the wind whistling around the corner of the barn. "Come on, people, this is a $20,000 tractor. Give me $10,000 to start. $10,000. A machinery jockey from Illinois offered $5. Another man took it to $6. It stalled there. A tractor that Bob had paid over $40,000 for just a few years earlier was going to sell for the price of a used car. I saw Bob flinch, a physical spasm of pain. He couldn't watch anymore. He turned and walked toward the house, his wife following, her hand on his arm. Then the auctioneer moved to the land. They sold it off in parcels. 160 acres here, 80 there. The prices were heartbreaking. Land that had been valued at $3,000 an acre was selling for less than $1,000. The buyers weren't local farmers. They were men in suits, investors from Chicago and Des Moines, vultures picking over the carcass of a failed dream. Finally, they came to the last parcel, the Home 80, the original piece of ground where Bob's house and barn stood, the place he had started. "Lot number 42, ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer said. 80 acres with house and buildings, a fine piece of property. Let's start the bidding at $50,000. Again, silence. The investors weren't interested in a house and an old barn. They wanted bare land. The auctioneer's voice grew desperate. 40,000? Can I get 40,000? I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Gus, the old farmer from up the road. His face was grim. "They'll give it away to some lawyer from the city, Cal," he whispered. "It ain't right." I looked at the house, where Bob and his family were hidden away, listening to their life be dismantled. I thought of his condescending laughter at my auction years ago. I thought of his pride and his ambition, and I felt nothing but a profound sadness. He hadn't been a bad man. He had just believed the gospel of the times, a gospel that had turned out to be a lie. I had been saving my money, living lean, while others lived large. I had a cashier's check in the inside pocket of my coat, money I'd earmarked to maybe buy a small parcel if the price was right. It wasn't a lot, but it was mine. It was real. 45,000, I said. My voice sounded loud in the quiet. Every head turned toward me. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. "I've got 45,000 from Mr. Miller. Who'll give 50? One of the men in a suit conferred with his partner, then shook his head. They were done. 45,000 going once, the auctioneer chanted. Going twice. He paused, scanning the crowd one last time. Sold for $45,000 to Calvin Miller. The gavel cracked, and it felt like it sealed an entire era. I hadn't bought a piece of land. I had bought a piece of history, a piece of a man's broken life. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a heavy, somber responsibility settle over me. As the crowd began to break up, I walked toward the house. I didn't know what I was going to say, but I knew I had to face him. I found Bob in the machine shed, sitting on an overturned 5-gallon bucket, staring at the empty spaces where his tractors used to be. The vast shed, once a cathedral to modern agriculture, was now just a hollow, echoing space, smelling of cold concrete and diesel fuel. He didn't look up when I walked in. "The bank says we have to be out in 30 days, he said to the floor, his voice flat and lifeless. 30 days to pack up a lifetime. Don't know where we'll go." I stood there for a long moment, the auction papers folded in my hand. "I bought the home place, Bob," I said quietly. He finally looked up, and his eyes were filled with a terrible, empty bitterness. "You?" "Of course. Came to gloat, did you, Cal? Came to tell me you told me so. Well, go on, get it over with. You were right. Your junk heap tractor and your penny-pinching ways. You won." "That's not why I'm here," I said, my voice firm, "and nobody won today. We all lost something." I unfolded the papers. "This is your home, Bob. It's where you raised your kids. It's not right for some stranger to own it." I held the deed out to him. "I'm not a banker. I don't want your place. I want to help." He stared at me, his face a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about a rental agreement," I said. "You stay here. You live in the house. You use the sheds. You pay me a fair rent, what you can afford, when you can afford it. You get back on your feet, you get a job in town, whatever it takes. And when the time comes, if you're ever able, you buy it back from me for exactly what I paid for it, not a penny more." He stared at the papers, then at my face, searching for the trick, the angle. He found nothing but sincerity. His tough exterior, the last remnant of his pride, finally shattered. His shoulders slumped, and he put his face in his hands. A dry, racking sob shook his whole body. I stood there awkwardly and put a hand on his shoulder. We were two middle-aged men in a cold, empty shed, surrounded by the ghosts of ambition, and for the first time, we weren't neighbors or rivals. We were just men, humbled by the unforgiving calculus of the land. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. The farm economy slowly healed. Bob got a job driving a truck for the local co-op, and he paid his rent every month. He was a changed man, quieter, more thoughtful. Sometimes, on a Saturday, he'd come over and help me work on the Steiger. He'd marvel at the simplicity of it, the raw, brute force of the old Cummins. "You know," he said to me once, holding a greasy wrench in his hand, "I spent more on dealer service calls in 1 year than you've spent on this whole tractor in a decade." The community's perception of me had changed too. Calvin's folly was now spoken of with a kind of reverence. Younger farmers, struggling to get started, would stop by, not to look at new iron, but to ask how I'd fabricated a part or how I'd managed to keep the old 806 running so long. I wasn't the crazy old fool anymore. I was the man who had seen the storm coming. I was the survivor. My son, David, grew up in the shadow of that crisis. He didn't see farming as a way to get rich quick. He saw it as a way of life, something to be protected and preserved. He spent his high school years in the shop with me, learning to weld, to rebuild an engine, to understand the mechanics of self-reliance. He didn't have any interest in a shiny new tractor with a computer screen in the cab. His hero was the old Steiger. One crisp fall evening, years later, David was home from college for the weekend. We were out in the field, ploughing under cornstalks with the Steiger. I had finally painted it, a uniform coat of industrial green, not unlike the original. It still wasn't pretty, but it looked proud. I had the throttle pulled back, and the big Cummins was settled into a deep, effortless roar, the 7 plough bottoms slicing through the rich black earth behind us. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. I throttled down at the end of the field and looked over at my son. He was a young man now, strong and capable, his hands already showing the calluses of a farmer. "You know," I said over the rumble of the engine, "Bob Henderson is coming by tomorrow. He's saved up enough. He's buying his place back." David smiled. "That's good, Dad. That's real good." "He was a good farmer," I said, more to myself than to him. "He just got caught up in the times, listened to the wrong people. My father always said, the bank will give you an umbrella when the sun is shining and ask for it back the minute it starts to rain. He was right. I looked out across the land, my land, every acre paid for in cash and sweat. "This tractor," I said, patting the simple steel dashboard, "it's more than just a machine, David. It's a lesson. It's a reminder that the only thing you truly own is what you don't owe anyone for. It's not about how much you can borrow. It's about how much you can build with your own two hands." I slid out of the seat. "Your turn," I said. David climbed behind the wheel, his movements sure and confident. He put his hands on the controls, the same controls I had pieced together from salvage yards and sheer stubbornness. He looked over at me, a look of deep understanding in his eyes. He knew the story, he knew the cost. He pushed the throttle forward, and the big Cummins bellowed its familiar song. The tractor surged forward, pulling the plow, turning the earth, preparing the ground for a new season. I stood there in the fading light, the smell of diesel and rich soil in the air, and watched my son drive my legacy across the field. The old, burnt-out, written-off piece of scrap iron wasn't just my future anymore. It was his, too. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that the farm was in good hands.